My name is Will. I'm one of the admission officers here at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. We're going to be talking about activities, work history, and the resume. And where does this all come from? So one of the big things that we care about a lot, this is something that has been really near and dear to my heart, working with Dean Moss and the rest of our team, is how can we make sure as many people have access, information, and the ability to really understand this admission process, knowing that business school admissions and the questions we ask can often feel just like a different world from other types of applications. If you're from a country that uses like test scores as a primary way of figuring out what school you go to, the holistic review process can be very different, and the types of questions we ask are different. So how can we really democratize access to that? Wherever in the world you're from, whatever resources you have or may not have access to. So that's where these all come from. So this year's workshops actually build on last year's workshops. So my teammates, if you could please pop in the links to some of the different workshops we had before. So there's navigating the application, what matters most, an essay workshop. And then there's 3 on sharing your story. What does a story mean in business school admissions? How do you start it? Like what parts, things should you consider? How do you communicate that in the written form? And then how do you communicate that in the verbal form? So like networking and interviews. So that series of workshops, super interactive. There's places for you to pause, do some writing and thinking along, and go at your own pace. This year's sessions are building on that. So it's going to be a little bit more of me talking. So I apologize for that. It's not as interactive, but we did get some feedback that you would love to know more about the process. How do we think about it at the GSB? And so really trying to embed that within here. So take this as it goes. It's a process. There's going to be multiple sessions that we're holding on different topics. And like I mentioned, this builds on what already exists. So if you already want to jump in there, get going, get your hands dirty, get your feet wet, all of that is available on our YouTube channel. The goal is really not to tell you what to do or what you should put in the application, but give you the tools to A, figure out, hey, here's who I am, and B, how can I share this with them? And I'm using them kind of broadly because hopefully some of the things we talk about will be helpful regardless of what school you might be interested in. Maybe you're not even thinking about going to business school at all. Maybe there's stuff that you're taking away for the job search or application to a different kind of grad program. And really helping find that power and value and pride and confidence in where your journey is going to take you. So, preface. There is a lot of advice out there. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. Maybe not bad, but maybe some of it's less applicable to you as an individual. Throw whatever you hear in here today within there, right? This is not a golden rule for how you need to do anything. These are just, hey, different ways to think about stuff. Here are different pieces of advice. Incorporate ones that feel right for you. And then, save those other pieces in your back pocket. Know they're out there, but you do not need to listen to anybody. Listen to yourself. That is the goal. And for the things that I'm talking about today, I'm going to be talking about them specifically through the lens of the GSB MBA admissions process. So I will not be talking about the MSX admissions process. They have their own info session. So definitely recommend checking that out. But for things like resume, you are definitely going to have coaches and support from the Career Management Center, recommendations for if you're thinking about pivoting, advancing, who your audience might be. Today, your audience is going to be the MBA admissions office. So how can we help you understand the way we think about things and what are stuff that I've seen, my team has seen, so that we can share, best practices and or opportunities to make sure you're putting, again, yourself in the best light. Okay, strategy. So this is the framework that we're using. I kind of made it up. So I don't know if it's actually a framework, but we're going to be calling it reframe and reclaim. The goal is for us to think about common questions, and instead of waiting and giving somebody else the power over them, how can we ask those questions in different ways so that you have ownership and you have power over what comes next? So what do I mean? Let's use this as an example. What's the biggest mistake you see in the application when it comes to resumes, work history, activities. I have a feeling if you're not already asking this, you might have seen it before, or you might be curious. So we're just going to open with it. So let's turn this on its head. Let's reframe that to what are some of the biggest opportunities that you see, right? And this is where I get really excited, opportunity, because all of you are going to be using the application differently, and that's exciting. So what are we going to do? We're going to give $1 million question. Some of you might have this question in mind already. Y'all might be thinking about it. It might seem familiar. We're going to tackle that one head on. Talk about these sections. What does it mean within the context of our application evaluation process? Then we'll also talk about things like, what should I share? How do I share it in a way that's going to be most effective? And I'll try my best to save some time at the end for live Q&A for anything that we haven't covered over the course of this session. I do have sections that are lightning round, frequently asked questions. So hopefully you'll also be able to knock some of those out along the way. So here we go. I don't know how many of you might have thought this, asked it, or have seen other people ask it in a webinar, for example. I am a blank, blank, blank. Can I get in? And I get this question a lot. And let's reframe and reclaim. So we need to know about the foundations of the GSB admissions process, the holistic review process. So here's a dictionary definition, but in admissions and in our office, we think about it as taking everything that you submit to get an understanding of who you are, right? The way you think, the things that you do, who's this individual that's going to show up on our campus, in our classroom, in our community. So we're going to be taking a look at everything you submit, testing transcripts, all of that to get a sense of who you are. So practically, what does that mean? There's no formulas, there's no equations. So if you start a question with this, how much do you weigh? Already reframe that, right? Because we don't weigh. There is no plus or minus scale, right? We're looking at everything together. We don't have benchmarks, cutoffs, or minimums or quotas. So often we get the question, how many people do you take from my blank? That is not a question that we ask ourselves on the admission side. We are looking for talent and leadership, regardless of where you're coming from. More on that in a second. No one part of the application is more or less important than the other, and context matters. And so today we're really going to be, these two pieces are going to shine really brightly. And then also the no part of the application, you're going to see why, one part is not more or less important, but they can all work together to help us understand you. So we're going to unpack each one of these with a little bit more detail. So what does that mean when it comes to that $1 million question? So let's take an example. So we're just going to put some meat on these bones. I am a, let's say, Nigerian, go ahead, Super Eagles, engineer with, testing and GPA. These are not criteria that we are necessarily looking for in and of themselves, right? So what are they? We're thinking about background, industry, academic history. These are all pieces of context that help inform, right, your achievements. So let's say if you are an engineer in Nigeria, the opportunities, the job trajectory, the things that are around you are probably going to look very, very different than maybe a consultant in Japan, right? And so helping us understand where in the world and where in your life you're coming from, that helps us understand, okay, how are these leadership competencies emerging? What does this mean in the context of your life? So let's reframe this to, how do my experiences as blank, 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 or the intersection of some of these different identities, right? That concept of intersectionality, how do those shape who I am and inform my accomplishments? This is one of those foundational questions that throughout this process, as you're thinking about, there's a lot of that metacognition, right? It's not just what you do, and how you think, but how do you think about how you think, which is also going to be a really great tool as you're a leader in different settings, right? What happened in that situation? Why did I act that way? Is there something else I could have done or I might be able to do in the future, either to amend that situation or to be more effective, you're already in that situation now with the application. So I want you to start practicing that. Why does this matter? So what we're looking for in the application last year, and for those, so in case you started this process before, maybe you're reapplying, you might have seen these phrases. They've evolved to this. And this year, we're really trying to be even more upfront about what we're looking for. And notice there's still really big buckets. How do you think? How do you lead? And how do you see the world? These are all, again, background agnostic, industry agnostic, academic history, all of those things. They show up in different ways for different people. And so that also means the way that you're going to be using the application is going to be different across the board. And that comes back to that preface and my kind of grain of salt advice. What worked for one person may or may not work for you, and that's okay. So let's figure out different types of advice to figure out which ones might work for you. So application composed of multiple parts. Go ahead and jump on our website right now if you want. Even if you're not thinking about applying for another few years, you can start an application and click through. That's going to be something I recommend later on, again, as a best practice. So I want to call it out nice and early. But rather than thinking about each one of these pieces in a silo, we're thinking about these working together to paint the picture of who you are. And yeah, there's like gaps and stuff in the image by necessity, like you are a three-dimensional, multifaceted human that we're trying to interpret through like the 2D application. But help us get this picture of who you are. And these pieces can work together to do that. And today we're going to be focused on these three sections, right? Optional responses, activities and work history, and resume. So let's go ahead and start with some frequently asked questions. And we're going to play the game reframe and reclaim. So here's one. What if I don't have any formal work experience? Maybe you are a college senior, or maybe you just started work 1 or 2 years in. What if I have many years of experience? It's the same question, kind of just from a different direction, right? For us, it's not about how many years you've worked, but given how many years or how many years you haven't, right? Wherever in your life you are, what have you done? How have you done it? How have you made an impact, and where are those footprints you've left behind? Because you could do that whether you've worked 1 year or 50 years. What does that look like for you? What if I don't have many outside activities? How do you spend your time, right? Because we totally understand there's some industries or jobs. Maybe you're an entrepreneur where you're constantly working, so you don't have time for outside. Maybe there is work-life balance and you really want to preserve that personal time. That's okay. Maybe there's family obligations. Help us understand what you do outside of the work setting. You'd be surprised at how many different places in your life you might be demonstrating leadership competencies and skills in quote unquote non-professional spaces, right? You might be helping your family through emergencies, grit, resilience, leadership, communication, conflict resolution maybe, right? So take that moment and appreciate all of the things you're doing in life. And weirdly, for a business school application, sometimes those are the moments that help shed the most light on who you are. Okay, how do I demonstrate that I'm qualified for blank? This is a question I often get. And for the GSB specifically, you don't have to convince me. You don't have to convince me of how employable or how viable your dream is for what you want to do beyond business school. We firmly believe if you get into the GSB, we will have the support systems. If you're willing to put in the work, we can make magic happen together, right? So it's less about convincing us. Have a goal, have a dream, have something that you care about. For us, it's about past behavior as a key indicator for how you might behave in the future. So for the things that you've done, how have you done them? What was that impact? Because, hey, these might be some of the skills that you're going to be exhibiting again in the future. So that retrospective look, that introspection, the reflection, definitely key in the GSB application process. And then how optional is optional? Here's the question I want you to ask yourself. Optional, totally optional. Whether or not to use them is, will this space help me share my story effectively? And so we're going to get to some ways to unpack that further. So already getting there. So jumping ahead, ways to prepare for what you might share. And if you guessed whatever you want, that might be fair. And thank you. I'm ready to receive my Pulitzer now. So moving on. So that reflection piece. So this is a non-exhaustive list of things that you might be able to think back on. I know for myself growing up, reflection was not something that was kind of talked about. It like my family, culturally, it was keep your head down, do your work. That's how you're going to get ahead in life. As I've grown up and as I've moved into different spaces, personally, professionally, socially, there are different ways of approaching this. And so I want to do more than just say reflect, but where can we start? Because I know I never would have known where to start if you told me this even 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So hopefully these can be some starting points for you, wherever in the world, whatever context you're at, to begin this kind of iterative process. So what's your path? Another question that I often get is, I don't have a linear path. I've tried different things. So what I want you to think about is, how might those chapters look? What happened in them? And more importantly, what about those transition zones between chapters, those pivot points? Why did they happen? What informed them? Who are you now because of them? And I think as you start to draw those lines and connections between kind of forward motions, U-turns, the ups and downs, you're going to get a better sense of who you are, not just because of well, very much because of them, right? Not every story is linear, but every story has value and purpose. So really start to unpack that for yourself. And then as we think about the milestones themselves, these are some of the anecdotes that you're probably going to be sharing in your application, right? So often we get caught up in these without taking the time to notice what that ebb and flow of your path is. But we really also want you to think about the milestones. What are things that you're proud of? And one that I'm going to talk about a little bit more on that next slide is impact. It's a very charged word. There's a lot of ways to interpret it. So I want us to break that down, because each and every one of you already is having an impact, right? And the challenge is being able to step outside and look at it from different perspectives to honor that, which can be very hard as an individual. So if you want to take a screenshot, now is the time to get some of these questions. You can take that photo in 5, 4, 3, 2, and go ahead and take that snapshot. All right, so moving on, let's talk about those milestones a little bit more. So what is meaningful for you? And I mean this very broadly. There are different ways to interpret this. Maybe it's the action or the outcomes that were meaningful for you. Think about 2 or 3 anecdotes in your life, personal, professional, things that you're proud of. Remember that question from the previous slide? Why were they meaningful for you? What were some of the actions that surrounded them? You might have heard of the STAR kind of framework: situation, task, action, result, often used for interviews. That can also be a really great starting point for how you think about these anecdotes in your life. 2 other pieces that I want you to explore and unpack with are context. So what are some of the situations and circumstances around kind of the situation? Like, is it a challenge that your company has been facing for a really long time? Is this a large workplace that you often don't get much visibility up or down? Some of these additional contextual pieces can often be helpful for us to understand, oh, okay, maybe there is a greater distance traveled here. Maybe you are working within kind of broader, like kind of headwinds. What does that mean? Context matters. And then impact. I often get like the concern, well, I haven't like influenced the lives of thousands of people. That's okay. Not everybody's going to do that. Most people will not do that, right? So what does impact mean for you? And that is the most important definition. I have no preference whether you've made a deep impact with one person, influenced a small group. Maybe you did do something on the global scale, who knows, right? I don't have a preference. But what does impact mean for you? So a couple of different ways for you to explore that are the so what. I did something, so what? But it also might feel a little impersonal, especially when it comes to things with other people. So another way to ask yourself that is, what's different? From my actions, from my participation, from my presence there, what is different? And that could be another way for you to think about, oh, that could be the impact. Or here are some opportunities now that have opened up, right? So lots of different ways to think about impact. Leadership, again, I said earlier, comes through all paces in your life. Wherever it comes through, we honor that. All right. We're going quickly because I do have a lot of content, so I apologize ahead of time if I'm speaking pretty fast. But now we're going to get into the tactical practical. Okay, so how can I actually share these things now that I have an idea of kind of some of those milestones, the situations around them? How do I actually share that? So understand your tools. So thinking about the activities, interests, the parts of the application. For activities, interests, work history, these are kind of the 4 places that I'm going to be focusing on today. And that's not to say that you can't be talking about these things elsewhere in your application, but I really just want to be able to focus on these chunks for the moment. So each section is going to ask you for a particular type of information. We've been really careful and thoughtful and just really intentional, even about the wording in any one of the sections for each one of these kind of text boxes to ask information that's going to be helpful for us. And we do it in a way that hopefully is also clear in what we're looking for. That said, how those pieces come together to tell your story is going to be different. And I have examples. So you can use these sections either individually or in dialogue with each other. Right? Each section, maybe you might have different answers for different situations, for different questions, or you might be answering one experience from multiple directions. So the big takeaway here is give yourself time to think, because if you just jump in and do one section at a time, that's one of those missed opportunities that I always answer as like, hey, what's that biggest mistake? Biggest opportunity is actually to take a look at the tools that you're working with. So that means scan through it early. Open that application now, even if you're not thinking about applying for a few years or just not really sure you want to apply, right? Check it out. Here, you don't need to read this employment history instructions. This is actually a snapshot from the application. This is just to illustrate that we try our best to be very explicit about the things that we're thinking about and that what we want you to answer. So this will also, if you take a look at it early, that can also help guide some of your thinking so that you can create a framework for, oh, here are things that I want to add. Am I missing anything? Are there other experiences? So you don't feel rushed at that 11th hour to be adding kind of new pieces, but rather refining and kind of adding dimension to what already exists. All right, here's where we get to some fun. Everyone's journey is different. And I mentioned that earlier. So everybody's going to use their application to tell stories differently. So we're going to do some kind of fun cases here where if you were an advisor or a friend, how would we support these 2 people? So I got 2 friends here. So one is Bill with 1 L, a zookeeper. Okay. Next person is Gil, also 1 L, who is an entrepreneur, has a passion for kind of sustainability, grass, astroturf, part of that, landscaping consultancy. Okay, so we're approaching the application. How do we think about, especially the resume? They're going to be our friends for the resume examples, to really tell that story. So we're going to follow their journeys, provide advice. And this is not to say this is how you have to approach it, but here are some ways of thinking, some best practices that our friends Bill and Gil are going to help illustrate that hopefully will be helpful as you move through. I fully recognize that some of you might be really far along or might have a lot of really great support networks. So this might seem a little maybe foundational or basic for you, but take a moment and hopefully you'll still find pieces that are going to be helpful. So, and again, this is in the context of the MBA application review process. There might be different advice, different ways you want to approach this, because when it comes to best practices and like that format, who is your audience, right? Keep your audience in mind. The thing that in the job industry, in teaching, hiring managers might be looking for different skill sets, different presentation than somebody who is applying for an engineering role. Same would go, by extension, if you're applying to a business school, what are the things that that school is looking for? Stanford, again, past behavior as a key indicator for how you might behave again in the future. And it's not just the what, but the how. And if you take those two pieces of information together, that can really help inform the types of information you put in the application as a whole. So keep that audience in mind. One page, basic business format, right? There might be a few instances where you go into the second page. Maybe you have more than 10 years of work. We definitely have folks with decades of work experience in our class, so that will never be an issue. Remember, right at the beginning, it's not about how long you've worked, but what have you done given that? And everybody has a different kind of path to the GSB. We don't have a preference at all for how many years of work you have. And the third is optimize readability. Right? You'd be surprised at how many applications or resumes I see, and it's size 8 font, crammed all the way to the margins with minimal space in between. And it just, there's a tension, right? How much space do I have versus how much information do I want to communicate? And that is also reflective of some of the challenges you're going to have as a leader, right? How do you be succinct and convey a message? How do you understand that audience? So already thinking about some of these exercises as practice for future events can also be a really useful way of using this, the application process, also as a growth opportunity. So we're going to give Bill some advice here, kind of approaching this brand new. And I also recognize that different countries, different industries have different sensibilities about resumes. And so hopefully this will give you some insights about the MBA, GSB MBA one. So photo, not needed. You never know. You don't want to put yourself up for biases, whatever that might look like. Also, that's landscape that you could be using to tell me more information about yourself. I personally, on the admission side, I do not care what you look like. I care about what you've done and how. And so this is one of those missed opportunities that you could be using the space to more to greater efficiency. Objective, not necessary in the MBA application side, because in applying to the MBA, I'm assuming that's your objective, or you're already talking about your other goals in other parts of the application. So no need to put that there. Save that space for something else. Skills, different ways to approach this. There might be actual skills that you want to include there, certifications certainly qualify, or, let's rethink, reframe. Maybe you're embedding some of these skills into the bullet points, right? So there's different ways to communicate kind of the talents and abilities that you bring to the table. There's also a lot of white space here. And sometimes I see that happening, especially when people use columns or different kind of getting creative with the space. You do not need to be creative. There's no points for creativity. Again, there's no formula at all in our evaluation process. It's about conveying information. And in this open space, negative space can definitely be useful. You don't want it to be a complete block, but you also want to be thoughtful about it. And, is this helping my message, or is it kind of stopping me from sharing something else? And that's going to be up to each one of you as individuals. Same thing as you look at this header, lots of white space. Again, use it thoughtfully, because white space and that negative space can also be a tool. And so think about kind of silver lining of everything. All right, so let's go on to content. So Gil is a little bit further, has some advice, has a couple of mentors who've helped advise on the resume. So this is a generic template. Again, you do not have to follow this format. It works for Gil. Why? So it allows you to think about, okay, what do I want to put on there? Don't get into my head as an admission officer. Those questions earlier, what is important to you? Those are the things that you should be putting in your resume. And think about the resume also as a snapshot of who you are, kind of professionally, educationally, and personally. You want to make sure that everything is in your resume. You might not need all the details for everything, because there's parts in the application for you to unpack those and explain those more. But for the GSB process, your interviewer, the only thing they will see is an updated resume that you share. And so if there's something that you want to make sure that they see, or is that you might be able to refer to in a conversation, you want to make sure it's there. as well as in the application where you might be talking in a lot more detail, right? And so make sure this is also an effective snapshot of who you are. If it's important to you, it's important to us. Here's something that I have seen over time. So this is not an official, like, you must do this, but be thoughtful. Some of the verbs that I see are very general. So I led something, or I launched something, I managed. What does that mean? So take a moment and think about some of those verbs that you're using. When you led something, does that mean that you came up with the idea and now you are supervising 3 people on its kind of inception and execution? Does it mean you actually literally led people on a tour, right? So there's unpack that. What does that mean? When you launch something, was it a global launch? Was it kind of launching an idea among, getting that idea off the ground with senior leadership? Or was it actually like rolling it out in markets, right? So the more you're able to reflect on some of those descriptors, you might not necessarily use all those words in your resume or your application, but they'll help you understand your accomplishments and your milestones so that you can, if you want to, or in an interview, be able to talk about it with that much more depth and specificity. Because those are the types of details that are helpful for me in admissions when I'm saying, hey, this is why Bill or this is why Gil needs to come here. Here is what they accomplished, and here's how. Here are those leadership competencies. So the more you're able to unpack and articulate those for yourselves, it's actually doing me a service on the admission side. So thank you ahead of time for doing the reflection. All right, so for example, okay, now we have bullet points. What goes on those bullet points? I'm going to have 2 ways of writing the same bullet point. Again, fictionalized, but which one has a bigger impact on you? So founder, sustainable turf, consults clients on landscape design and opportunities for sustainability. Or landscape designs brought 22 clients within city drought compliance standards. Drought's a challenge, climate change, we want to be thoughtful about that. 4 of those resulted in LEED certification. So hopefully the same one resonates for both of us. For me, it's B. And this is a what do you do versus what did you do? And there's actually going to be spaces in the application itself in employment history where it says, give us a brief description of your job. So instead of having to do that here in the resume, you might still want to do that depending on if it's a unique or niche industry or job or role, or it's something that you want to communicate to your whoever else might see it. But you can also use the space in your application itself to do that if you want, right? We're giving you that agency to make that decision for yourself. But the bullet points, hopefully, are going to be a little bit more concrete. What did you do? And here's where, if you're looking on the stuff that you did, it's easier to pin metrics to it. What are maybe some of those key performance indicators? How did you stack up to those? Was this overachieving, going beyond, or was this something outside of your normal realm of responsibilities, right? Past behavior, past context, super helpful in this process. All right, so how technical should it be? This is another question I get a lot. How nuanced, because every industry has its own set of jargon, language. Keep your audience in mind. So what do I mean? So Gil establishes hydro-conscious techno-natural xeriscapes utilizing indigenous biota to facilitate hydrosocial transformation in private, corporate, and governmental spheres. Cool. So let's reframe, rewrite, and try that again. Uses native plants and landscapes best practices to assist private, corporate, and government clients to develop water-conscious sustainability practices. A little easier, I think. Maybe the second pass, more people might have understood it. And if we looked at our past example of what do you do versus what did you do, let's take it to that next step and now translate that again to led 22 private, corporate, government client sustainability practice saving. And now you're able to put quantifiable metrics. There might actually be additional pieces that you didn't realize existed that I'm like, oh, wow, look at these accomplishments. Part of this is the iterative process to be able to put something down, come back to it, and give yourself the time to think through these. It'll often be helpful to have somebody to talk to about it. Maybe it's someone who's familiar with your work so can give you some of that feedback. And maybe it's somebody who is outside of your realm of work so they can tell you, I don't know what hydroconscious techno-natural xeriscapes are. Can you break that down for me? Because while we do have a lot of expertise in industries, and I can always ask folks on my team who have more experience in any given space than I do for advice, you want to make it as easy as possible for whoever's reading your application or your resume for that matter. And I also left the little red squiggly lines there on purpose because it does two things. One, it gets you to pay attention. If your word processor does not understand that as a word, is that necessarily a word that you need to do to convey what you did? Is there another way for you to phrase that that might be more understandable to the general public? And the second is it calls your attention because I spelled indigenous wrong. And so you also want to make sure that you're approaching this thoughtfully and eyes towards editing. Misspelling something, that'll never hurt you in the process. But again, this is a professional kind of application process and you want to put your best foot forward. Give yourself the time again to take a look at things, interpret, does this convey who I am effectively? Will somebody else understand the things that I've done and why they were important? Right. So a couple more resume facts, reframe and reclaim, and then we're going to head over to the Q&A box. I see a lot of stuff in there that's going to be helpful. So what if my work is confidential or I signed a non-disclosure agreement? So I often get this question for folks who work in government or defense. Reframe that to what can I share to provide appropriate insight into what I've done or its impact? There's also the additional information section. So if you want to name it, do it and say, the work I do is confidential. I am not able to share kind of the full extent of it, but here is, right? And that can also help give context if your letters of your recommenders also have kind of qualifications on what they are able to say, helps us. Context matters. All of these tips, helpful regardless of what application process you're using. So this year we are also using the consortium. And so I'm looking at the same information across all of the applications that come in. You'll notice if there is a supplement, compare that to the main, our own application. It's all the same questions. So there is no difference for me on this end. So all of the tips should be working regardless of the process. So same thing for this, add that piece of information because it can be helpful. Do I have to format my resume in any type of way to be effective? Flip that. I have no preference. I've seen some work for different instances that maybe some of the stuff I talked about today, they threw those conventions out the window when it worked. Ultimately, I want you to ask yourself, what format will help me convey my message most effectively? Sometimes, is that second page necessary? There are times when you worked for less than 10 years that maybe it's helpful. If you remember in Gil's resume, and maybe I can pop it up in a little bit, there were a lot of publications, right? Citations take up space. I think if you have a publication, you should totally put in a citation. Sometimes that gets you more into that CV curriculum vitae world, but understanding things like authorship, where was it published? Some of those can be helpful pieces of information as well. And so don't feel like you have to squeeze everything into one page if you can. It's recommended, but there are always instances and always exceptions where, oh yeah, you should totally go into that second page. So know that you also have that agency to make that decision. I will never be like, 2 pages, less than 10 years, but that is never going to be a thing, right? I'm going to be looking through because I'm going to say, hey, maybe there is a reason why we're onto 2 pages. Or, hey, maybe this is something that our Career Management Center can help coach them on once they're here. Okay. And so coming back to that resume, 10 pages. Do I really need that second page? Kind of got ahead of myself there. And if I can't fit everything into the resume, what should I do? How can I make the rest of the application work for me? And so we're going to come back to Bill because we focused on Gil a lot with sustainable turf and his resume. So now let's talk about Bill. Bill's a zookeeper. And so we're going to get that in the resume, but zookeeper, there's a lot of potential tasks. Is there a part of the zoo that Bill works in? Is there a particular, maybe business development? Maybe it's actual animal husbandry. Maybe it's on the veterinary side, but maybe it's complex. Hey, in the employment history, here's that section I mentioned. What are your primary job responsibilities? That drop down for this job was full-time, part-time, internship. So no worries there, that's pretty straightforward. Reason for leaving, maybe it's a promotion, maybe an opportunity showed up, right? There's other things that you might want to share with us to help explain some of these transitions, that might not be appropriate or feasible in your resume. Think about the employment history part on the application as a way to have dialogue there and give us that information. So maybe Bill launched a lemur conservation program and there's an award. You might see that award listed in the resume, but what was it for? What was the foundation of it? In the awards and honors section, you can tell me a little bit more about that. What did you receive it for? Is it a large scale thing? Is it a company recognition? Give me some of that context. And maybe there's even more. Maybe there's the so what of it. Maybe the conservation program now has allowed for the reintroduction of endangered species back into their native habitat in Madagascar, right? What is that so what? Maybe that's where you take that time to provide some of that information, the context, the challenges, that so what in the short optional answers that, in that bullet point in your resume, you might not have been able to cover. That in the honors awards, maybe was missing, maybe doesn't fit elsewhere. The impetus for the short answer questions actually came because the what matters most to you and why essay, hallmark of the JSB application experience. In the past, we actually saw folks putting in impact examples of things they were proud of that didn't neatly flow with what matters. And we want you to be able to answer in the spirit of the question. And so we decided to create these spaces because if it was important to you, it's important to us. We want to know about your accomplishments, why they're important, their impact. So that's where these optional short answer questions got pulled out to give you the space to do that so you could answer kind of in fullness of what matters most to you in the purity of that question. So that's where that came from. So hopefully that helps you see how, yes, these parts of the application you can use in dialogue with each other. Or maybe for the short answer question, it's just something independent, a little standalone that might not have fit neatly elsewhere. So being thoughtful, move through the application to see, okay, how can I use this to best effect for myself? And here's my last slide before I jump into the Q&A box. I do see a number of questions there. Think about it this way. In the spirit of reframe and reclaim, your experiences are your power. These are the things that I want to know about. You are the expert in you. Your task is to figure out, okay, how can I use this application and admissions process, including the interview or whatever else might come along the way, to tell that story most effectively. Each and every one of you has value. Your journey is important. Understanding who you are because of experiences is important. Okay? So really honor that. And it can be hard at first. Imposter syndrome, those doubts, very real. And so this is also a process in acknowledging that. Find folks who you can talk to about it. Maybe it's talking to the admissions office. Maybe you're emailing our main line and Nancy or Maria is helping advise, hey, think about it this way, or check out this website. We have information here that can help you, right? Or here's a webinar that we have already. Check out this link that might be able to support you, right? So think about the different support networks to help you identify and embrace that value. It takes time, so thank you for joining us this early in the summer. As I mentioned, there's already other videos available in case you want to get a head start and start practicing some of these things. So you have time to iterate and continue evolving over the course until round 1, round 2. No difference between applying round 1 or round 2, especially if you're looking for direct enrollment to start next year. No preference and no difference on the evaluation admission side, whether you apply through our platform or if you're a US citizen permanent resident through the consortium, or QuestBridge if you're one of QuestBridge alumni. Bottom line is, you are the most fascinating person in the world to me. When I'm reading your application, you are the only thing that exists. I want to know about you. This is a confidential space for you to tell me whatever it is you want about you. I'm not sharing this information with faculty members. No students will see this. As I mentioned earlier, your interviewers will only see an updated resume that you share with them. And so please know that I am honoring this space, because I know for some folks, you might be going into vulnerable spaces. Sometimes even sharing the things you care about and are excited about can have feelings attached to them. This is a space where we honor that. Thank you for letting me share in your journey. But right now, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the Q&A box to see where I can help out with these last few minutes we have together. So Lenica, how does telling your story and communicating your background to Stanford change in the different spaces that you might be applying via? There's no difference. So there's no additional lens or perspective. As I mentioned, I'm going to be we're asking for the same types of information across whatever platform you're applying to the GSB through. We talk about equity, and this is an exercise in that. And so for you, what this means is you don't have to change anything about your approach. Share you in any one of those spaces. What I will recommend is for each of the schools that you might be applying through the consortium, check with them if there's ways that they recommend approaching their parts of the supplement or their own institutional supplements. And that could be a way to help make sure that you are honoring the process that every school has put in place. Do I recommend tying together experiences from different industry from Hannah? Up to you. And because for some people, they might be different chapters. For others, they might be a continuation of different themes. Maybe you're connecting those in an essay somewhere and not in kind of the optional places or your employment history necessarily. Maybe it's even opportunities in different industries that you've experienced during college. Who are you because of those, right? Reclaim that power. Who are you? And I think that is, in a very, very weird way, an incredible lens to look at a professional trajectory. That'll actually be really nice to think about, like unpacking that sense of self-awareness, because thinking about who some of the most successful and kind of effective leaders, that sense of self-awareness can be really, really helpful there. Okay. Professional experience on the direct enrollment should only be post-grad work. Internships held during college are to go in the activities and interest section. Similarly, on the resume, should college internships go under activities and interests rather than work experience? Good question, Brandon. That's up to you. So I have no preference where that goes. If anything, I've seen it go anywhere. Oftentimes for internships, they'll say as your title intern or what role you had, and that'll be clear enough of a demarcation for me. I know some people will say professional experience kind of broadly. Other folks might separate it into full-time employment versus internships because they might have had multiple. Again, make this space work for you. What makes the most sense for you? 3-year entrepreneurial work on the resume. Is it too much to have a 2-page CV? From Brian, it depends. And take a look. What is it that you're trying to communicate? What's helpful here? And in the GSB application process, it's not just the descriptions of what you do, remember, but what did you do? Why was it important? Go ahead and take a look at the other parts of your application where, hey, maybe I'm just listing some of these things here as maybe like a list, bullet points, whatever. And then the application, I'm unpacking them to give more of that detail. So again, think creatively across the different spaces. Do you need that 2-page? If yes, do it. If not, where else can I share that information? How do I justify 5 job changes in 10 years of work experience? Let us know. You don't need to justify. We know every career trajectory is different. If you want to explain additional information, you can even go in there. If you're not already telling me a little bit about it to the rest of your application, additional information, you can say, here are some of the circumstances where that have informed why I've moved across multiple jobs. You'd be surprised at how common that is. And so don't feel like you're at a disadvantage necessarily. Think about, given those experiences, what have you done? Who are you because of them? how have you kind of managed the spaces that you've been in? So once again, thank you so much for joining me today. Hopefully there was a couple pieces of information here that were helpful. End of the day, you got this. Take care. Hopefully I'll be able to interact with you again over the course of the summer. But once again, every journey is valuable. You are awesome. And if nobody has told you yet today, I hope that today gives you something to smile about. Take care, all.